The room is still, but not with peace. The silence is swollen, broken only by the faint rasp of breath and the low buzz of flies that refuse to be driven away. The air is thick, heavy, a stench that clings to velvet curtains and golden walls, a sweetness gone sour, the smell of flesh turning against itself. Candles burn low, their wavering flames casting cruel shadows on a body that was once the very image of majesty. The leg is black now, stiff and swollen, skin cracked like scorched earth. Every movement sends a ripple of pain up through a frame once draped in jewels and silk. Beneath the wrappings, the flesh softens, liquefies, sinking away from the bone. To touch it would be to push a finger through ruin, to feel the body of a king collapsing while he still draws breath. And he knows it. He smells it. He is trapped within it. This is not the quiet passing of age. It is a slow descent into rot. A living corpse seated upon a throne of gold, rotting in plain sight. And yet, through the haze of suffering, the monarch endures, lucid, conscious, forced to watch the grandeur of his body dissolve day by day. The Sun King, who reigned over Europe for more than 70 years, who bent nations and nobles to his will, who declared himself the state itself, spent his final weeks watching his own flesh betray him, piece by piece. How could the most powerful monarch of France die in such agony? If stories of history's forgotten endings intrigue you, subscribe to Echoes of Time, where the past still whispers. He was not merely a king. He was France itself. Louis XIV ascended the throne as a child and ruled for 72 years, longer than any monarch in European history. Under his gaze, France was transformed into the beating heart of the continent. His word was law, his will the measure of nations. He raised Versailles from marshland into a palace that shimmered like a jewel, a monument of gold and mirrors where sunlight itself seemed to bow to his presence. Courtiers lived in constant orbit around him, every glance, every gesture, every favor dictated by his mood. He commanded armies that marched across Europe, bent rival kingdoms to his ambition, and reshaped the map with the weight of his victories. Painters, poets, composers, all sought his patronage. To serve him was to serve glory itself. For decades, he was untouchable, a figure cloaked in divine right and earthly power, his body adorned in silks and his image cast into statues that declared him immortal. They called him the Sun King, for as the sun gives life to the earth, so he claimed to give life to France. And yet, beneath the splendor, there was still flesh. Flesh that could falter, organs that could betray, blood that could sour and poison the body from within. The king who embodied the state, who defined majesty, could not escape the truth waiting in the marrow of every man. That power, however absolute, cannot silence death. If you are drawn to the paradox of greatness crumbling into frailty, subscribe to Echoes of Time, where the brightest crowns meet the darkest endings. August of 1715. The gardens of Versailles shimmered under a punishing sun, and Louis, though in his 77th year, refused to surrender the rituals that had long defined his image. Surrounded by huntsmen and hounds, he rode out into the fields, determined to embody the vigor of a monarch whose strength had not dimmed with age. The air was sharp with the scent of horses and trampled grass, the horns echoing through the forest. It was then, in the midst of this ritual display of vitality, that a sudden jolt of pain seized his left leg. A fleeting spasm, deep and sharp, like a claw raking through muscle. He shifted in the saddle, forced himself onward, unwilling to show weakness before those whose loyalty was bound to the illusion of his endurance. To stumble was to break the mask of immortality he had worn for decades. When he returned to the palace, the pain lingered, gnawing with quiet persistence. The physicians, men who had long basked in the privilege of serving the body of a king, examined him with studied calm. Their verdict was swift. Sciatica, nothing more. A common affliction of age, they assured him, hardly worthy of concern. A few remedies, a little rest, and the sovereign would soon be himself again. But beneath their reassurances lay ignorance. What began as a twinge would fester into ruin. The dark seed had been planted, invisible and unyielding, and no courtly confidence could smother what was already taking root. The flesh of the most powerful man in Europe was beginning to turn against him. If revelations like this grip you, if you want to follow the hidden fractures in the stories of the mighty, subscribe to Echoes of Time, where every triumph carries the shadow of its end. The pain did not fade. It grew, day after day, swelling into something darker, more insistent. The king's leg began to throb, the flesh tightening, the skin warm to the touch. Alarm spread quietly among his attendants, though none dared whisper of it beyond closed doors. For the Sun King was never ill, he could not be, and yet his body told another story. Summoned to confront the mystery, his physicians gathered in solemn council. At their head was Guy Crescent Fagan, the chief physician of the realm, a man whose word over the king's body carried the weight of law. Learned in the doctrines of Galen, he saw illness not as an invasion to be fought, but as an imbalance of humors, blood, phlegm, bile, to be corrected through ritual purges and bleedings. Such methods had lingered for centuries, carried forward by tradition rather than proof. The king was bled, his veins opened to release what they believed to be poisoned blood. Purgatives followed, bitter draughts that scoured the body, leaving him weaker with each dose. Cloths soaked in ointments were bound to the leg, prayers were murmured as if faith could drive back decay. Yet nothing eased the agony. The swelling deepened, the skin mottled, darkening at the edges like fruit beginning to rot. The doctors, blind to what we now know as gangrene, mistook the signs for minor inflammation, for the lingering aches of age. The irony was brutal. The most advanced medical minds of France, practicing their craft at the pinnacle of European civilization, were powerless, bound by theories older than the empire itself. Their efforts did not halt the disease, they hastened its march. What they offered in confidence became a sentence carried out in slow motion. Some people say medicine has always been trial and error. Do you agree? Tell me in the comments, and if you want more untold medical tragedies from history, subscribe to Echoes of Time. The days that followed became a grim procession, each marked by a fresh descent into ruin. What began as a sharp ache now spread outward, seizing the king's leg with merciless grip. The swelling grew until the limb seemed scarcely his own, stretched taut beneath silken wrappings. Then came the discoloration. First a shadow along the ankle, then a black spot, small as a coin, that darkened with every sunrise. It was the visible face of decay, spreading like ink through parchment. By the second week, the odor had become impossible to deny. It drifted beyond the bedchamber, seeping into corridors gilded with mirrors and tapestries. Courtiers, once eager to bask in the monarch's presence, began to recoil, covering their faces with perfumed cloths, their eyes watering as the stench of rot crept into their lungs. Yet none dared abandon him, for to be seen absent in the twilight of the Sun King was to risk exile from the world he had created. So they endured, as he endured, bound together in an atmosphere thick with sickness and dread. And still Louis remained lucid. His mind was clear while his flesh dissolved beneath him. He issued commands, spoke calmly to attendants, even attempted to continue the rhythm of his daily rituals. It was a cruel paradox. The sovereign's spirit unbroken, trapped in a body that was already surrendering to death. He could hear the muffled coughs of those around him, smell the corruption of his own flesh, and yet he endured in full awareness. Modern medicine knows what his physicians did not. Gangrene is not simply a blemish on the skin. It is the death of tissue, a spreading necrosis that poisons the blood and overwhelms the organs one by one. As the blackened flesh consumed his leg, infection coursed unseen through his veins, reaching the very heart of his body. Each day was not merely pain, but a step deeper into systemic collapse. For 22 days, the most powerful man in Europe lay in gilded torment, the grandeur of Versailles transformed into a mausoleum of suffering. His courtiers witnessed not only the decline of a king, but the unraveling of a myth, proof that even the sun itself could be extinguished by the shadow of decay. If you believe no throne, no crown, and no empire can shield a man from death, subscribe to Echoes of Time, where power meets its reckoning. In the midst of that darkness, there was one figure who refused to leave his side. Madame de Maintenon, his companion in the final decades of his reign, remained at the bedside as the smell grew unbearable and the flesh turned against him. While others gagged behind silken handkerchiefs, she leaned closer, whispering prayers, offering the comfort of presence when comfort itself seemed impossible. Hers was the devotion of one who saw the man beneath the crown, and she bore witness to every groan, every sigh, every word. Louis himself, though racked with torment, did not collapse into despair. He spoke with a strange calmness about what was unfolding. He confessed to his attendants that death no longer frightened him, that he had lived long enough to see glory and folly in equal measure. To Maintenon, he murmured that he had loved too much war, drained too much treasure, and left France too heavy with debt. It was a rare glimpse into regret from a man who had spent his life cloaked in grandeur. And to the child who would succeed him, his great-grandson, still too young to comprehend the burden of rule, he gave advice between gasps of pain. Rule gently, avoid war, remember the suffering that extravagance can bring to a nation already bleeding. These words, spoken from the threshold of death, carried more humility than perhaps any he had uttered in life. Here was the paradox laid bare. The king who claimed divinity now faced his mortality with dignity. The monarch who once declared, "I am the state," now confessed that the state had cost too much in blood and gold. His grandeur was dissolving, but in that surrender lay a fleeting humanity, more powerful in its fragility than all the victories he once commanded. If you've made it this far, you're part of the few who stay with history's darkest truths. Subscribe to Echoes of Time and join a community that remembers. Beyond the chamber of suffering, another struggle unfolded in whispers and secret councils. The Sun King's breath grew shallower with each passing night, and with it, the certainty of succession loomed. His great-grandson, the boy destined to become Louis XV, was barely 5 years old, too young to wield the scepter that had commanded Europe. The question was no longer if the king would die, but who would shape the kingdom once he was gone. Philippe d'Orleans, the late king's nephew, moved quietly into position. He was ambitious, shrewd, a man long overshadowed by his uncle's dominance but ready now to seize the regency. Courtiers pledged allegiance in hushed tones, weighing the shifting balance of power even as the monarch still clung to life a few rooms away. The Palace of Versailles, once a theater of splendor, had become an antechamber of intrigue, where every glance carried the weight of calculation. Even as his body failed, Louis attempted to impose his will upon the future. He warned his heir against the temptations that had defined his own reign. "Do not be seduced by endless wars," he counseled, "for they bleed the nation dry. Govern with restraint, for glory purchased with debt will turn to ashes." These words, spoken by a man who had once emptied France's coffers in pursuit of conquest, now rang with the bitter clarity of hindsight. Outside the royal chamber, the truth was already plain. Decades of conflict had left France exhausted, its people burdened with crushing taxes, its treasury nearly bare. Versailles gleamed with unmatched beauty, but beneath the mirrors and marble lay cracks of discontent that no gold could conceal. The Sun King's death was not only the passing of a man, but the unmasking of a system stretched to its breaking point. Was Louis's final advice a confession of failure or a gift of wisdom? Tell me in the comments. And if you seek more shadows hidden within the halls of power, subscribe to Echoes of Time. The last hours came slowly, like the tolling of a distant bell. On the evening of August 31st, the chamber was thick with incense and murmured prayers. Priests gathered at the bedside, their voices low, reciting the litany for the dying. Courtiers stood in silence, watching the man who had ruled their entire lives slip toward the unknown. His body was wasted, his leg a mass of blackened ruin, yet his eyes still burned with awareness. He whispered farewells to those nearest him, bidding Madame de Maintenon withdraw to rest, though she refused. To his attendants he spoke calmly, urging them to remain loyal to the child who would succeed him. And to the court as a whole, he offered words heavy with the finality of a man who knew the curtain was falling. "I depart, but the state remains." The night deepened into morning, and with it the last fragments of strength ebbed away. As the clock struck just after 8 on September 1st, 1715, the longest reign in European history ended. 72 years of triumph and terror, of opulence and exhaustion, concluded not with thunder but with a breath that simply did not return. The Sun King, who had styled himself the very embodiment of France, was extinguished, and with his death, the great palace seemed to darken, its mirrors reflecting not eternal glory but the shadow of uncertainty. A child now carried the crown, and the dawn that broke over Versailles was not gilded with splendor but veiled in doubt. Was Louis XIV's end a punishment for his pride, or just the fate of human flesh? Drop your thoughts in the comments, and if you want more voices from history, subscribe to Echoes of Time. Death did not bring dignity. No sooner had the Sun King's breath ceased than the surgeons of Versailles prepared the royal body for its final ritual, the embalming that would preserve him for eternity. The work began in solemn silence, blades glinting in candlelight as they opened the sovereign who once declared himself immortal. But what they found inside was ruin. The leg, blackened and stiff, revealed only corruption. When the abdomen was opened, the air filled with a suffocating stench so strong that even hardened attendants staggered backward. The organs, long weakened by infection, crumbled at the touch. The liver collapsed into pulp, the intestines spilled apart in the surgeon's hands. When they sought to remove the heart, that emblem of divine power, destined to rest in a separate reliquary, it disintegrated into fragments. The body of the most powerful monarch in Europe resisted even the preservation of death. Still, ceremony demanded completion. What could be salvaged was gathered, wrapped, and sealed. Days later, a grand procession carried him to the Basilica of Saint Denis, the ancient necropolis of French kings. The banners flew, the bells tolled, the rites were spoken. Yet beneath the grandeur lay a truth impossible to mask. The Sun King had rotted in life and defied preservation in death. Even in burial he was a symbol, that no gold, no marble, no crown can shield the body from decay. Some viewers will never subscribe, and that's fine, but tell me in the comments why. For the rest, join Echoes of Time to keep history alive. Versailles still stands, its mirrors polished, its gardens vast, its halls echoing with the footsteps of tourists who marvel at its brilliance. It is the monument Louis XIV carved out of swamp and ambition, a theater of absolute power meant to project eternity. His wars redrew the map of Europe. His patronage fed the genius of painters, architects, and composers. He defined fashion, dictated etiquette, and placed France at the very center of the world's gaze. For more than 70 years, he succeeded in making himself appear untouchable. But the ending stripped away the illusion. Behind the gold, there was still flesh. Behind the crowns, a body vulnerable to rot. His legacy is grandeur, yes, but it is also a warning. Versailles gleams, but his body crumbled. His voice shaped nations, but his final words were confessions of regret. His name endures in history, but his remains were reduced to dust like those of the peasants who bent beneath his taxes. In the end, the Sun King was conquered not by an enemy army, nor by rebellion, but by the very laws of nature he could never command. His life proclaimed majesty. His death whispered truth. This is what becomes of even the greatest kings. History doesn't fade, it echoes. Subscribe to Echoes of Time, and let's keep listening together.